Hi, everybody. Welcome to the HCD Mindset. This is part of season 2, but a special topic. We really felt the need we needed to hop on real quick and discuss something that came up in our recent webinar. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, please do. We also have it on the YouTube here, the HCD Research YouTube. The webinar topic was, what is AI anyway? Where we had a discussion with some PhDs and professionals that work in AI, all the experts on getting the best information and using it in the most appropriate ways. And we really discussed some really interesting topics, and we only had an hour, and so we didn't get to discuss everything. But we wanted to dive in particular with AI and emotion. So Kathryn and I were talking, and we decided to have this special topic so we could dive a little bit deeper. And so join us. So happy to have you here with us. As usual, a little brief intro before we get into the topic. My name is Michelle Niedziela, VP of Research and Innovation at HCD Research, and I'm joined by Kathryn. Kathryn.
Hi, everybody. Kathryn Ambroze here. I'm the manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences. And I am so excited to be here to talk about, like Michelle had mentioned, AI, but also how emotion actually plays into this context and what it really means in a bunch of different areas, because algorithms, machine learning, AI is all really prevalent in what people are talking about right now. It seems to be at the forefront of every article and news segment. So it's an important topic to cover. Before we get into it, though, I'll let Michelle share a bit about HCD.
Sure. So we've been running this vidcast series for a while now. Been really fun, but where we talk about special topics that are involved in market research. For us, HCD is the market research house that really focuses on holistically understanding the consumer experience, everything they perceive, evaluate, and respond to in the world, on the shelf, on the TV, whatever it might be. HCD uses all sorts of different types of innovative tools in order to do this sort of work. Particularly applied consumer neuroscience, which is really the combination of psychological testing, neuroscientific testing, and traditional market research methodologies. And we use that to better understand the human experience, particularly when it comes to product development and marketing. So that can include anything from the early stages of exploration all the way through validation, product development, all the way through marketing. And we can do this work globally. We do it in person or online. We've been all over the world. Our equipment can travel anywhere. So without further ado, I just want to go ahead and launch into our discussion, because it was so exciting to have the conversation with everybody just a couple of days ago. And we just really felt the need to talk about something in particular a little bit more. When we were talking about the question, what is AI anyway? We talked about its application to emotions research, because that is so important to market research, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really, and Michelle, you've covered this quite a few times, like, what is emotion and how do you really define it? It's so challenging. So then to take that really abstract, sometimes confusing concept of emotion and apply it to something like AI, where you are coding and everything is very tactful and intentional, is a really challenging thing to try to overcome and to try to really put into a box, essentially, when we know that emotions is everything but. So Michelle, can you kind of share a bit just about what we do know about emotions, what we can say they are?
Yeah, it's so funny, because if you ask anybody, if you were to go outside of your house right now, masks, right, and ask somebody, what is emotion? They're probably going to tell you love, happy, sad, right? And those are emotions, right? Mm-hmm. But what is emotion? Like, how do you define emotion? So those are examples of emotions, but it doesn't tell you what emotions are. Strictly defining it, I believe it's defined as a both mental and physiological state change, right? Mm-hmm. So it could be, combined with, maybe you're sweating a little more or your heart is racing. It's connected to memory, right? So there's that's the interesting thing, is there's so many different theories about what emotion is. And I think that's what people don't realize. So when they think about emotions, they're thinking categorically, happy, sad, love, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to theory of emotion, some people look at it categorically and other people look at it like on a continuum, meaning you can be a range of happy, right? So you can be negative to positive, you can be relaxed to excited, and you can be approaching to withdrawing. And that's more of a multidimensional look. And then other people are really focused in on the learning. So maybe you don't know how you're supposed to react to the world around you, but you learn the appropriate way to react. So while you might be reading cues, such as my stomach is feeling different sensations, or my palms are getting sweaty, these things indicate to you that you're feeling something, right? But then the context that that's situated in informs even further how you should be reacting. So palm sweating, it could be that you're scared, right? And which makes sense if you're in the woods and you see a bear, right?
As one does.
Yeah, palm sweating could mean something really different if you're on a first date, right? So, which is also scary, but you're also feeling excited and happy. So it's a different context, a different situation. And so it's really important to recognize and appreciate that actually we don't know what emotions are. We try our best to describe it, I think, is the problem.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really good point about how we are socialized to react in certain ways, and that we've definitely said this in the past, where culture and environment all play a role in how we're going to portray our emotions. And this was something that was brought up in the conversation during the webinar, the idea of we have the agency to really decide to some extent what people are seeing and what we express. So I could be feeling really, really happy and or really, really sad, and still have a same blanket face, because that's what I was either taught growing up to express, or maybe it was just how what I wanted to share with you. And so there is this really intimate part of emotions that we have to consider in this conversation, especially the broader conversation of emotions with AI, because we do have some agency over what we choose to put on our face. Absolutely. I will smile back at someone if they smile at me. We talk about that all the time, that it's, you know, it's a very personal choice as to how you're going to make certain facial expressions. And it's a very vulnerable part of being a human. Anybody who's cried in front of someone for the first time knows that that is a very intimate experience. So there is something really special about that.
Because emotion display, like facial expressions, are a form of communication, right? I mean, if you think evolutionarily speaking, it's a way to warn other people. So when they talk about the basic emotions, and I kind of brought this up on the webinar as well, that there are 7 basic emotions. One of them is neutral, and 5 of them are negative. And only one of them is positive. It's the joy one, right? And then the other ones are all negative. There's so many basic negative emotions because it is supposed to act as a warning system, either to alert somebody else that there is a predator around, right? So the facial expression on my face should be able to warn you that there's a bear in the woods, right? Or that, okay, I just ate this terrible thing and do not eat that. Right? Or I sense danger, something like that. I need to be able to express that to the people close to me, right? Or maybe to defend myself. I need to show that I am angry. I need to show that I am scared, that I am ready to act.
That makes so much sense. And even in the way that you're describing things, your facial expressions are to some extent helping you communicate your story, helping you navigate what you're trying to say. And there's some ways that you can communicate without saying a word. So like you said, if you tasted something, or even if you just smelled something that didn't smell pleasant, you can make a face that's letting everyone else know, oh, something's a little nasty. And it's funny, but if you think about it, we do communicate with our face constantly, like we communicate with our body language. It's a very similar concept. But now thinking about it, when you're trying to detect emotions in other people, we as humans try to associate what we interpret as emotions and then whatever the person in front of you is doing, and then really draw associations and understand what they are trying to communicate with you. So
there's a real problem with what people are displaying versus what they're actually experiencing, right? Because as you said, you have agency. And so you can even think about it in terms of when people say, put on a brave face, right? So I can have experienced something horrible, let's say like a loss of a family member, and I could get up and put on a brave face and smile and give a speech, right? And people do that all the time. And being able to sometimes read beyond what they're showing you is very challenging, especially when you think about different cultures. And so this has been a big deal when it comes to people making judgments about people that are public figures, you know? So, oh, they didn't display enough emotion, or they didn't look sad, or they didn't look happy, whatever it might be, without taking into account that maybe their cultural situation doesn't allow for a lot of expression, or conversely, maybe their culture encourages a lot of expression. And so that's really important, that the face does not always tell you how the person's really feeling.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because we can even put it to just, sex differences and gender differences, that there's these expectations that are put on men and women to react in a certain way, to perform in a certain way. And those performative measures are really in place because it's basically the rule book that society has created to say, right, oh, this is the universal symbol for, if a woman is giving you a hug because she, right, it's okay, even though there's some situations where it's not, appropriate for that interaction to occur, for that expression.
Grin and bear it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it becomes a question now, where does AI really fit into this? And can AI actually be intelligent enough to determine all of these really complex intricacies of how we all interact with each other?
And I think that, again, was a really interesting part of the conversation. And I thought that Evie, the professor from the University of Alabama, brought in a really interesting point. She studies sign language. And some really interesting points she brought up was that when you're studying sign language and syntax in sign language, you want to be able to examine the flow and the expressions people make as they're making their signs, right? So, going through the different signs and then showing, they try to use AI to make predictions and better understand different aspects of the signs that people are making. But there's such a small population of natural native speakers, right? And her point was that a lot of times they try to fill in the gaps of data by extrapolating information. And they use AI to do this by grabbing imagery and videos from the internet, let's say, of people doing sign language. But those people may not be native speakers. And so it's very much like going to someone who just learned German a month ago and using their syntax and their style of speech and phonetics and everything, and accent, to make predictions about natural speakers. So of course that is not valid, right? And so I thought it was really interesting that a big theme of the conversation that we were having seemed to be around the quality of data going in, right? And the theory behind the data going in. So if you're studying something like syntax of sign language and you need to see people's facial expressions, which are part of the sign, right? And you need to be able to see the natural flow of progression of the hand movement, making sure that you're basing things off of research that was on the appropriate data is really important. I think that goes with emotions as well. So when people are often using AI, let's say with natural language processing or facial coding, the data that they're getting, how real is it? How is it actually detecting emotions, or is it just detecting a display of emotions? I think that's a really interesting question, because facial coding is, of course, built on a very specific theory of emotion, and that is categorical. And so therefore you only have the 7 basic emotions. You do not have the entire set of emotions to deal with. But also those emotions were based off of actors. And I think that's what people don't realize, is that it was based off of being able to measure the movement of the eyebrows, or the corners of the eyes, or the corners of the mouth, or the wrinkling of the nose, or the forehead, whatever it is, chin movement. Those things are what fuel the algorithms for facial coding. And those things were based off an actor being told to show me happy, right? That's happy.
Right.
Show me sad, And so you see these pictures that are on the screen right now, and that's an actress, right? And it's something that we can all recognize. So I think that's a huge difference on detecting emotions. We can universally all recognize that someone is smiling and that might be happiness, but that's different than the person actually experiencing it.
Absolutely. That was really insightful. And I think that especially with the use of what AI can do, you can't expect it to really interpret as a human can. And it's going to see everything for quite literally face value, because that's as far as it can go with the data set that it's given. So that is a really important part. And I think that especially in, the world of social sciences, you have to consider context constantly. And
absolutely,
that counts for the words that we're using, that counts for the way that we present the question. And if you're using, I love that example of the sign language. It was very impactful because it's like, if I was to talk to somebody down south, I have a very different accent compared to somebody that's from Texas. So they use different words or, enunciate certain parts of speech that I typically don't do. And I may not even understand what they're saying because of the difference in, guttural tones and things like that. All of those things do come into play when trying to tease apart exactly what somebody's trying to say. And it shows just how valuable and intricate emotions are.
And that you really need to understand the theory behind the data. You need to understand your data that you're using. AI is a great tool, but you and I recently reviewed an article that was talking about using AI to make predictive data, taking a small set of eye tracking and filling in data using AI, right? So that you can make predictions about what people would be looking at, whether it's on UX or packaging or whatever it might be. And given what Evie was saying there, I think that could be really dangerous, right? Because if you're basing something on a very small data set and trying to extrapolate to something larger and fill in data there, if you're not really sure about the theory behind of the methodology and technology you're using, you could be in a really awkward space.
Oh, absolutely. The implementation of it has really grave effects if you try to scale it out to something that's not within its scope. It really just speaks to those 10 people. That's your population size. And it's so small that you really have to consider how generalizable it could actually be.
Right. So I think appreciating that. I mean, again, AI is a great tool, and being able to fill in data gaps is a very useful thing to do, but you just have to take it with that caveat, with that grain of salt, to be able to understand what you're getting, right? Or not getting. And so when we think about that point exactly, this whole idea of emotion recognition and predicting emotion and mental states, we get into a really weird space, right? Where people start predicting people's attitudes. It's used in social media and different types of technology. Social listening on Facebook to be able to predict when people are getting upset, using voice technology to see if, in complaining consumer, are they escalating too much? I mean, there's interesting applications here, but what are your thoughts on it?
It's really interesting, like you said. There's the idea of predicting. It's this concept of forecasting what is going to happen. And to kind of tie it into what we were just saying, you can only forecast so much depending on what you end up actually having, because we do say bad data in is going to be bad data out. So if you are finding a data set that has these, these biases and things like that, those will be not only represented in whatever the machine learning take care of, but it actually is going to highlight it and emphasize it, because that's what machine learning does. And I always think back to that example of the Twitter bot that they had created to have it really be self-sustaining. Like it could just, put out tweets that everyone wants to hear and things like that. And they had to dismantle it within 24 hours because it became this horribly sexist, ageist, anything that you could think of that creates a terrible person. It was just spewing out these terrible things and saying these things. That's because there's some bad tweets that are put out into, into this data set. So it's going to be emphasized, and that has to be considered, because there is, especially when you're considering things like emotional recognition in tweets, a tweet is really flat. You don't really know what the person is trying to say. And there are things like sarcasm that have to be considered, where you can say the exact same sentence in 5 different ways. And it can mean all different things depending on how you perform it. So I think those are all really important things to remember.
I think you also have to consider who would go to social media to talk about something emotional, right? So same thing as in the comments. So if you, by the way, go ahead and leave a comment here if you'd like to, emotional or not. But in all seriousness, people who leave comments on products, for example, are they more likely to be negative comments, or are they more likely to leave positive comments? And there's some really interesting research on that your average consumer probably doesn't leave a comment at all. So you're only getting the extremes. And I think that was probably the case with social media as well, because while back in the day in Facebook, it used to prompt you with, Michelle is. So what am I right now? It was very boring. People were saying, I am eating toast. And those were the first days of Facebook, but now it's like really extreme. It's over time, everything anybody posts has gone really towards extremes, and no longer talking about, oh, I'm eating toast. So it's interesting, but I think that's a huge part of it, recognizing the bias in people's behavior. What are they more inclined to do in social media or in commenting sections than they would in real life? And I think some other examples we have here, again, with the facial coding, considering that, again, the issues with emotional recognition, but I think people are also starting to really look towards wearables. There's been a push by some companies to start including wearable information, or maybe even tracking in your car to check your emotion. There's, other, video surveillance that is happening in airports, et cetera, to track emotional issues happening in crowds. But I think people very, very much so, I think something that in prior conversations I've had with Ricardo and Iman from the webinar was kind of that Jurassic Park idea. Just because you could doesn't mean you should, right? Absolutely. Especially since it could be really faulty science that you're basing things off of. I was alluding it, sort of linking it to phrenology that we talk to a lot, which is, labeling someone's personality based on bumps on the top of their head. And I think that's really similar here, trying to label people based on faulty science.
Absolutely. Right? And it's important to remember not just faulty science, but technology advances all the time. And there are always going to be limitations to every device that you use. So even though a wearable sounds really cool and it's a really exciting gadget to get to play with, there's no end all be all. And it's going to have certain limitations where a lot of the technology will actually buffer the data or clean it out excessively, where, it really becomes questionable what is actually useful here, what's going to actually tell us a story. So
it's really unfortunate that I think a lot of the time, the people that are pushing these technologies to be put in things like cars, or being pushed to put them in airports, or to monitor social media, they are more likely to be computer scientists that are very excited about the AI, but they don't always include psychologists or neuroscientists, in that research or in those approvals. And I think if they had included more of those, even social psychologists, sociologists, like anybody to better understand how people act in groups or what the theories are, they would say, absolutely not, don't use this. Right. But I think people get so excited by the technology, as you were kind of saying, that they skip the hard part, right?
Absolutely. And it's really, you have to remember that there are concerns for data collection. You have to consider the potential for manipulation and the potential for exploitation in any of these situations. So there should be this accountability in finding the balance between privacy abuse and then actually having data informed decisions. And I think that that's something really important that we have to touch on, because you have to appreciate what privacy is and to remember that there's people behind the data, and that's where it comes from. It's always a human.
And so what are you using that data for? You know, and I think it's something we brought up in the call, in the webinar, was that there was a paper that came out in Nature that there's been a lot of discussion about, where they were using facial recognition, looking at people's facial features to predict their political affiliation. And while that sounds really interesting scientifically, this is incredibly problematic, especially when you think of certain countries that have been imprisoning people because of their, you know, religious or political affiliations. Can you imagine the repercussions of something like that? The ethics involved in that are staggering, like just really knocks you off your feet when you really start going down the rabbit hole there. There's research out there that shows that you can do something like using facial recognition. If you get a picture of someone's face, using AI, you can make predictions about not only their sexual orientation or their political affiliations, but they can pretty well accurately even predict what your name is. And that's really crazy, right? Yeah. And, you know, if you're really interested, reach out to Ricardo from the webinar. I think that we can, you know, have a link down below if you can, if you want to check out the webinar to see more on this. But it's a really interesting conversation about the concerns that can happen, especially, again, if you're thinking about, you know, faulty data going in about someone's emotional state, that someone may, say, be arrested in an airport, or that someone's car may decide to stop working, right? Because of some expression that they made on their face. Is that something that you trust and that you want?
Exactly. And it's like you said, you could be more prone to these due to, you know, things like the color of your skin. You can be more prone to these because of your sex, and even, I guess, your name to some extent, and how you present yourself. All of these things can actually, in a way, work against you if this data is not handled properly. And that brings us to the idea of a concern in terms of the pacing of regulation. So you have to remember that the government so technology always wants to go fast, because the goal is always to be future thinking and to really be innovative. That's just the nature of technology. So when you're considering that, there's always going to be policy lagging behind, and you won't ever have it actually catch up. But it becomes this question about, you need these rules in place, but what if you don't actually even understand what the technology is doing? So how do you put a rule in place when the policymakers are a bit restricted in some ways?
That was an interesting issue that was brought up with the webinar as well, that the EU just came out with some new rules regarding AI. And there's a serious pacing problem here, and I don't know how people are going to deal with it. The language in the ruling is very confusing, and so there's probably going to be a lot of people trying to figure out how to interpret it appropriately. But what's interesting is that the language that is used has implications beyond just AI when you think about it. So one of the terms that is used is nudging, right? And I thought that was really interesting, that it was saying that AI cannot be used in the EU for purposes of nudging people to their detriment, right? So there's a couple words that stand out: nudging and detriment. Nudging would be the behavioral economic term that is used about influencing someone's behavior. So, you know, it could be something as simple as having more recycling bins nearby to encourage people to recycle more, right? Or it could be trying to lead people to make decisions, and I think in the case they mean that they don't want to make, right? But what does to their detriment mean? So I think John had brought up the question of, does to their detriment mean soda, right? So sugary beverages could potentially be bad for your health. Having an advertisement that used AI to better understand what people want in a sugary beverage, is that using AI to nudge people's behavior to their detriment? That's a very slippery slope.
Right. And it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Having that vague language really does make it challenging, because you can easily say, well, I interpreted it this way, and I don't find it detrimental for you to have soda. I think that that could be a great part of your daily routine, is to be able to treat yourself. And what if you want to indulge in something like a soda every once in a while? Who said it's a detriment? Maybe that's helping somebody avoid a bigger, a bigger issue like smoking. So they turn to soda. And, it really becomes questionable about where do you stand in terms of making these decisions?
Absolutely. And so I think that it's definitely that pacing problem, where I think they're trying to keep the language open because they don't quite understand the technology, but also the technology is constantly advancing and changing. And so it is hard to make legislature that can keep up, right? This is a huge issue. And I think that we will have another conversation with some legal experts around the issue of AI, and that'll be coming up soon. So stay tuned. I hope that you have clicked the follow button here so that you can subscribe and get an update when that's released. But we're going to have a matching program to this one to sort of explore those issues. But it really is about this algorithmic accountability to make sure that you're doing the right thing, that your data is correct, that you're appreciating people's privacy, you're staying sensitive, because there's a huge bias in a lot of these measures, which we didn't even talk about yet, but I know we've talked about on previous episodes. If you do want to link back to some of our discussions on facial coding, those in particular are based off of Caucasians. There's a huge racism problem in facial coding, and also in all facial recognition technology, where it really struggles and can be biased against people of other ethnicities than Caucasians. And that's a real issue that people need to talk about.
Yeah, the first step is really having these conversations, making people aware of what they're doing with the data, what access you have to, changing your control, and what control you as a consumer have, but also what the control of the business has and what government can do. So having these conversations is really important. And we hope that this was a good first step to helping you understand this really complex issue.
So I hope that you will subscribe, as I said before, so you can get updates on when we have new releases. Whenever we have further conversations, we do have, like I said, an upcoming conversation with a couple legal experts around the issue of AI that we'd love to have you join us with. So thank you so much for joining us. You can reach out to us on Twitter and tweet with us, visit our blog where we write further about these things. If you have a question about anything, you can email us directly, or you can just leave something in the comments below. Or if you just want to write anything, emotional or not, feel free to add that below. Link with us on LinkedIn. Come stop by the office if you like. I believe that's on there too. But in any case, actually, we're not there. But in any case, have a great day, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Take care, everybody.